Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Katharina Mokura, and I'm a member of the Public Education Committee for ADAA. That's the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Welcome to our webinar. Today's topic is the mindful way through anxiety. And I'm very excited to be presenting our presenter, Dr. Elizabeth Roemer. And these webinars, just a little bit about ADAA. I'm very, very happy to have Dr. Liz Roemer with us. The webinars are part of ADAA, and ADAA is a nonprofit in the field of anxiety and depression. Our mission is to improve the diagnosis and promote the prevention, treatment, and cure of anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorders through education, like this webinar, and through practice and research. So I'd like you to please take advantage of our amazing resources on our website, adaa.org. You'll find a number of excellent resources, like find a therapist, where you can search for providers. We also have a peer-to-peer online support group that you can take advantage of. And if you have a question after watching the webinar, you can also send an email to webinar@adaa.org. Okay. And lastly, you can support ADAA by making a charitable donation on the website. So let's get started. I am very happy to introduce you to our presenter, Dr. Elizabeth Roemer. Dr. Elizabeth Roemer is the chair and professor in the Department of Psychology at University of Massachusetts in Boston. She actually authored 4 books with Dr. Susan Orsillo. Dr. Roemer has developed an acceptance-based behavioral therapy for generalized anxiety disorder, and they've examined this treatment in studies funded by the NIMH, that's the National Institute for Mental Health. Their self-help book, The Mindful Way Through Anxiety, Break Free from Chronic Worry and Reclaim Your Life, and the self-help book workbook, Worry Less, Live More, The Mindful Way Through Anxiety workbook, draw from their decades of research in this area to provide guidance to people struggling with anxiety. So we are pleased, very, very pleased to have Dr. Roemer with us. And I'm just gonna go ahead and present and just have Dr. Roemer take over.
All right, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And I will work on getting my slides up right this minute. Hang on 1 second. Can you see?
There are your books. Yeah.
Okay. So I can only see my slides now and not the whole thing. Is that okay?
I believe so. That should be fine. You could also, you should be able to just see the slides on the main screen, and can go through the slides as we talk.
Okay, great.
Okay. I can see you perfectly fine on mine. So I think the viewers should have both of us on their screen as well as the slides.
Excellent.
Okay. And I see the 2 books that I previously mentioned on the slide. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with mindfulness?
Sure. So I have been studying anxiety ever since graduate school, which was in the early 90s, and studying generalized anxiety. And I came to my interest in mindfulness kind of in 2 ways. I think the first mindfulness book I read was John Kabat-Zinn's Wherever You Go, There You Are, which I believe in college. And there was a lot there that was really interesting to me. I think often there are reasons that we come to study what we study, and I certainly naturally, and I think through learning, have a very busy mind. And I think the idea of engaging in practices that would help me be able to pause a little and be a little aware and kind of work with my mind differently was really appealing to me. So I had a kind of casual interest in mindfulness from reading. And then I began practicing yoga. And so for me, really, the major kind of experiential practice that brought me into mindfulness was noticing my experience in doing yoga and the ways that the process of being present in my body and trying to do challenging poses and my body not always doing what I wanted it to do or not looking like the person next to me, those kinds of thoughts that come up, when we're doing anything. And having this practice that allowed me to bring my attention back to just what my body was doing and what it felt like and it being as it was in that moment, as opposed to how I wanted it to be, was really interesting to me. And I think through that experience, I was able to see the ways that mapped onto the kinds of things I was studying as I was trying to help people work with their busy minds, their worrying minds, and the ways that this kind of ongoing practice of coming back again and again to just noticing judgment, but not believing judgment, and those kinds of things that happen naturally through any sort of practice was really mapped onto the kinds of challenges that anxiety brings. And so I got really interested in both of them together. And then sort of at the same time, there was a real move inside the cognitive behavioral world to start thinking about mindfulness and acceptance with things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. And so I began looking at those and then working with my colleague and friend Sue Orsillo to work on treatments that actually integrated those things.
Okay, so it sounds like you had your own experiences of the noticing versus experiencing, and that it was just the timing was was fortuitous in that this was what was happening in the field, so you ran with it.
Exactly, yeah, and it really, I think it allowed me to see the kind of the similarities between more traditional psychological theories and what comes from what is obviously this ancient wisdom that has been around a lot longer than our traditional theories, and the ways that they mapped on.
Okay, and given that many people are experiencing anxiety and not in an adaptive way, I believe you have a slide showing us the differences between what's adaptive and not so adaptive, the signs of anxiety.
There we go. Yeah, so kind of as a starting place, as we're going to talk a little bit about how mindfulness may map onto anxiety, and hope that that's of help listening. Just to sort of acknowledge that, one, that anxiety is natural and human and part of our experience, and also that it's broad. So sometimes anxiety is like tension in our bodies or sort of feeling on edge. Sometimes people experience it as an anxious arousal or a kind of panic with heart racing or palms sweating or feeling like you're going to have a heart attack. It can kind of be any range of those things. Often people have anxious thoughts or worries. This is something that Sue and I have spent a lot of time studying, thinking a lot about what might go wrong in the future, partly almost to prepare for it, but kind of not getting to the preparation part, just like, what if this happens or that happens or that happens, and the ways that worries can feed each other. Or that it can be a felt sense of it, like an anticipation or a sense of dread and fear. Sometimes anxiety is really general, sometimes it's specific. So people get anxious in certain situations or certain reminders of difficult things that have happened in their lives. Often it's very natural then, if we get afraid of a thing, to avoid those things. And so anxiety sort of goes hand in hand with avoidance. Sometimes so much that people aren't even aware anymore that they're anxious because they've restricted their lives. And so they're not arousal anymore, but their lives are constrained of things they feel like they can't do.
And then some people, they might.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. So some people might do such a good job avoiding that they don't even recognize that they're anxious or worried.
Exactly. I remember early on in my training, asking people like, are you afraid to fly? And them saying no. And me saying, have you ever flown? And them saying, no, I would never fly. Which is absolutely makes sense. Why would we choose to put ourselves in these scary situations? But at the same time, that can really narrow our lives. And And that relates then to how anxiety gets associated with a bunch of other things. It's natural for anxiety and depression to go together. That's part of why ADAA was formed, recognizing this interconnection of anxiety and depression, and the importance of attending to both. And then also it's very common for people to use other strategies to manage their anxiety or try to get rid of it. And so certainly substance use and substance abuse often goes with it as well as other things.
Okay. So the different people have different profiles of anxiety. You'd say some people are much more conscious of all the worries that they are bombarded with. Some people will say, I can't stop thinking. My mind just won't stop. Others are more physical manifestations. Do you find that mindfulness, I guess maybe you'll talk a little bit about this later in your presentation perhaps, but whether there's an expectation of how it should help people with different profiles or how people might experience it?
Absolutely. I think it can help really with any of those profiles. And you're absolutely right. It takes these different forms. Sometimes people kind of have all of these, but absolutely sometimes, it's really happening in their bodies, but not as much in their minds. Maybe their minds are more blank. Sometimes it's more cognitive and thinking based and not so physical. For me, at least in my experience of working with people, I think the differences then are, and I will help me remember to talk about this a little later as I talk about how to apply mindfulness. I think it can be helpful to kind of work in the domain where you're having less difficulty first to kind of build up this and then move. So for instance, if you're somebody who worries a lot, starting with being aware of your worry is going to be really hard. It's going to be easier being aware of your breath. And then as if you have a lot of anxiety connected with your breath, I wouldn't necessarily start there because that's going to be kind of a harder practice. So you build the skill in the domain where it's a little less challenging and then build up as you build the skill to more challenging is kind of how I think about it. Okay. Maybe if it would be helpful, I could talk a little bit about sort of how I understand how anxiety happens.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so just kind of a lot of the things that people may already know, but sort of to put them all together. A really important thing about anxiety is that even though it's really unpleasant and it can really restrict our lives, especially when it gets extreme, it is adaptive that we're able to detect and anticipate danger. So at its core, anxiety is a productive thing. It is good that we can say, like, this might be dangerous. Maybe I shouldn't go there. And for that reason, we learn anxiety and threat very, very easily. A kind of classic example of this is anything related to taste aversion. Like if you eat something and then you get sick, you don't want to eat that thing again. That's really good because if that were poison, it's great that you're not like, I wonder if this was bad. You're just like, no, don't have that. That's really adaptive for survival. On the other hand, because we can get anxious just because things are associated, or because someone told us to be anxious, we can learn to fear many, many more things that are actually dangerous to us in a significant way. So we learn through direct experience by having negative experiences, and we can learn to associate that anxiety with everything around us at that time, or through observing other people. And I think one of the things that people have been asking me about a lot lately is kind of what our current media environment and the fact that it's so easy to be exposed to catastrophic things really easily, like how that affects anxiety. And I think there is some evidence that general anxiety is being raised because, it used to be that, before there was TV or whatever, you learn danger through your direct experience. Now you can learn danger by seeing terrible things happening all over the place that's not near you at all. And that can still be this kind of associative learning. And then also through instruction. So if people around us, and especially people we trust, tell us that something's us, we'll be anxious around that thing. And so that can lead to being anxious around a lot of things. And it's different for different people. There's probably some biological predisposition to whether we learn it really well and really quickly or not, and sort of how quickly and other learning. And then there's just also going to be that people have different kinds of exposure. So people who have been exposed to more scary things are very often going to experience more anxiety. And again, it's natural that if we are afraid of a thing, we don't go near it. However, if we don't go near a thing, we can't learn that it's not dangerous, because that basically maintains our associations.
Right.
This is the way that anxiety kind of feeds on itself. And we can even learn to avoid our own reactions. So essentially, we develop anxiety about anxiety. Because if physiological arousal or this worry or this tension is a marker that something out there is dangerous, then I can begin to associate that just the physiological sign is a sign of danger. And so now I'm afraid of my experience. And so now I'm trying to avoid my own experience, which, as it turns out, we can't really do.
Okay, so let me just, so what I'm understanding is that there's a distinction between the ways in which people develop these anxious anxiety reactions, or anxiety in general, through exposure, through observation, through having somebody tell you, don't do this, be very careful, and so on repeatedly. But then there's also the other side, which is what maintains it, what keeps it alive, what keeps it going is the avoidance, not wanting to go through that experience or go anywhere near what you associate as a threat. Kind of keeps it alive because you never really find an alternative reaction to it.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I think this, I'm remembering my slides right, this next slide just sort of shows a little bit of a picture of the way it sticks around, what keeps it going. So I'll just describe kind of these three boxes. And there's lots of different ways of talking about this. This is just a way that I think Sue and I have found is helpful. So one is that we start to react to our internal experiences in these challenging ways, right? So anxious thoughts arise, or we feel like a tightness in our chest, or sweaty palms, or a sense of dread. And then we have a reaction to that, like, what's wrong with me? Why do I always get anxious? Other people aren't anxious like this. Why is my mind so busy? Why can't I just get rid of these thoughts? Those kinds of things, right? So judgments and critical reactions arise naturally because, again, these reactions feel like signs of danger, and so we want to get rid of them. And also because we get a lot of messages that anxiety is weakness, and we don't see a lot of people admitting that they experience anxiety. Right? So we have this kind of reactivity to it, and also a very natural response, which is that the thoughts that arise while we're anxious seem true. We tend to take our thoughts as truth. So if a thought arises, oh my God, I'm not making any sense right now while I'm giving this presentation, I can think, okay, like that might be true, or try to be clearer. Or I can think, oh my God, I'm not making sense. Oh no, I'm not making sense. And what do I do? I'm not making sense, right? And now I'm going to kind of spin because I've taken that as a definite truth instead of just a question, a thing that arose. Could be going well, could be going badly. I can't really tell because I can't see anyone. So the way that we react then is really naturally going to lead us to try to get rid of these experiences. And so that's over on the left. The rigid efforts to avoid internal experience, or sometimes it's called experiential avoidance. So trying not to think anxious thoughts, trying not to feel anxious in our bodies, have emotional responses that are anxiety provoking. Those efforts, there's a lot of research that shows that actually makes anxiety worse. It increases distress, it increases reactivity, it increases judgment. So that's why those arrows go back and forth. So now we're stuck in this back and forth. In addition, the third part of it that's also really important is that if we're trying not to feel things, we are sort of by definition going to stop doing things. So if I don't want to feel anxious, I'm not going to agree to do a public webinar, right? Because doing this is going to elicit some anxiety, at least for me. I always get anxious around any kind of public speaking. So if I am trying not to feel that, I'm going to have to not do things like this. But if this is important to me and I want the work I do to be of help to people, I have to do this, right? And if I don't do this, then I'm going to feel bad. So now, and give me more things to have a challenging relationship with, right? So it's just going to keep going. And it's natural. It's not because, we're trying to undermine ourselves or we're being self-destructive. It's just these feelings are uncomfortable. It's natural to want to get rid of them. You can't really get rid of them. So then it's very easy to then kind of constrain your life and then get stuck in this cycle.
Okay, so the awareness that this is a natural tendency. No one wants to feel unpleasant emotions or unpleasant anything. That's our tendency, is just to stay away from those things. But once we realize that this is what's keeping the anxiety alive, so to speak, then we can kind of talk ourselves into staying with it a little longer, is what I'm hearing.
Exactly. Staying with it, and also, right, responding to it differently. So one, if we recognize that these habits are learned, one, that can help us be kind of less critical of ourselves, right? So I'm not a weak person. I'm just a person who has learned to have anxious responses, which and actually, again, adaptive in part. Like this is how my genes survived, is that I have a tendency towards anxiety. But the other thing that's really nice about understanding things as learned is that we can also learn new habits. So just as that kind of cycle has led to stronger and stronger and more rigid patterns, we can flip away. And so one way, exactly what you said about awareness, if we turn toward our experience instead of away from it, that's shifting that pattern, right? If my pattern is always I try to get out of it, and I just intentionally stop and turn toward it. Oh, what am I experiencing right now? What's happening? I've broken that cycle a little bit. I'm not doing the same thing. And kind of build on that a little bit. We can also even change how we turn toward it, right? Because you could turn toward it and be like, oh my God, it's a terrible feeling, but I'm turning toward it. Or you can turn toward it with kindness and curiosity and sort of openness. So what is this right now that's happening? What are these thoughts? What's happening inside my body that is making me want to run away, or that is, associated with these difficult thoughts I'm having? And then the other kind of wing of that is that we can, while we're relating different to our internal experiences, make some intentional choices to keep doing things that are important to us. And again, I have a little sort of just to get that in a visual, because sometimes it's easier to picture it that way. So in relation to this difficult relationship with internal experiences, we can cultivate a more expanded awareness. So I think I didn't mention that part before. Another thing anxiety causes us to do is narrow. And again, this is good. Like if you're like out in the wilderness and a saber-toothed tiger is coming toward you, you want to pay attention to the saber-toothed tiger. You don't want to be like, hey, that's a nice tree, right? Because that's dangerous. But if we're experiencing anxiety and there isn't something coming towards us, then actually what's happening is like we're maybe noticing all the angry looking faces in an audience, or the mistakes we made in something we just did, and maybe aren't noticing like the person who was smiling and nodding, or the things we did well, or the other parts of it. So one thing we're going to want to do is just expand out, not ignore, not turn away from whatever's threatening, but see the threatening and other things too. So we're having a broader experience. Be more compassionate. And then by decentered here, that's a kind of term that's used often in the field. What we mean, and we don't mean not centered, so it's kind of a confusing word as I'm looking at it, but decentered means having our experiences as what they are. So when I say, like, I notice that I'm having this thought, as opposed to just like, I'm doing a terrible job. I'm having the thought that I might be doing a terrible job is a very different experience than I'm doing a terrible job, this is going badly. The change in relationship towards internal experiences, that's going to naturally lead to more acceptance of our experiences and willingness to have them, right? So that's the awareness, and then also a different experience of it. And all of that will help us to increase mindful or intentional engagement in things that matter to us. And again, those things will feed on them.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, totally fine.
Sorry to interrupt. So let me ask you about the noticing the anxious thoughts and noticing, oh, here I am thinking about the upcoming presentation. I'm so nervous. Here's that thought again. That thinking about it or observing the thought or noticing that I'm having this thought, is it from an observer standpoint, kind of like watching the thoughts happening?
Mhm.
And does that get us away from experiencing? So I think that's something that I think people might have a push and pull about. If I'm observing the thoughts, am I experiencing it enough to be able to turn towards it? You know what I'm asking? I'm not sure if I'm being
Yeah,
clear.
I think so. Yes, and I think you're asking a really interesting and important question, which is kind of, if let me know if I'm hearing you right. This kind of like, is there, if you're turning towards it and experiencing it, but not experiencing it, like, are you distancing from it? Like, are you sort of intellectualizing
Right.
rather than allowing it? And I think that's such an important question because, and a thing I'll say about mindfulness, which I'll go on to talk a little bit more about in a minute, is
Mm-hmm.
anything we do, we can use to avoid or we can use to engage. And mindfulness is like that too. So it's absolutely the case. And this comes
Mm-hmm.
time where I'm working with people, or I've had this experience myself as well, of like, you get this impulse of like, I will just notice this thought and then it won't bother me anymore. And once you're
Right.
for that, then you are actually avoiding. You're avoiding in a very clever way, right? You're like, doing mindfulness, right? It's the same as, this happens all the time. People will say like, well, I want to practice mindfulness to clear my mind.
Right.
Well,
Right.
of course, like I would love to clear my mind too. That sounds lovely. But at some point, if what you're doing is practicing in order to clear your mind, you are essentially trying to control your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And so a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Not, I think what I would say is that when you're practicing, you'll sort of, sometimes you'll be experiencing it quite a bit, and sometimes you'll glimpse a moment of, oh, it's a thought. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes I think of it as like there's a little space around it. Like it's still
Okay.
completely there in front of you, right? So you're not like, I'm going to be mindful and put this over here. Like it's right here.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe instead of being here, it's like here. And so
Mm-hmm.
I see like, here's all this distress I'm having. And I can just a little bit notice that this does not define me. This isn't all there.
Mm-hmm.
The concern I'm having about the talk or what I did wrong yesterday or whatever that is. So it's like softening it a little, making a little room,
Mm-hmm.
but it isn't getting rid of it.
Okay. So rather than getting caught up in it completely and hijacked by how bad I feel and having it in the first place, you can notice it and also still feel whatever the thoughts bring.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
No, and sometimes, I mean, in my own experience of practice, sometimes it's like the thinnest bit of observing. Mostly I'm just experiencing it. And it might even be
Mm-hmm.
just remembering vaguely that
Mm-hmm.
I believe that I will not always feel this way for eternity, even though I do feel that way right now.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of practicing with that, and then other times you may have the experience of like, oh yeah, this is the kind of thought that has sometimes really caught me and it's not catching me so much right now for whatever reason. But that
Mm-hmm.
won't catch me tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think mindfulness is, for me at least, the practice is being able to sit with it and turn toward it, whatever way it occurs, like not putting a condition on it. I will sit with it as long as it doesn't last too long or feel too hard, or, it's like, I'll sit with
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
It will
Mm-hmm.
wax and wane as I sit with it.
Yeah. I like what you said about how it's good to not try to put conditions around it. Like
Yeah.
there has to be a perfect way to do it, a perfect way to be with the thoughts or turning into it. That's kind of creating unnecessary
Right, and human and
yeah,
natural, right? Like, I mean,
barometer. Mm-hmm.
the most common thing I think that I have when I like ask people, if I haven't practiced for the first time, is,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm bad at it. And I always say, like,
Right.
oh, like, there you go. Like, let's look at what our minds do so easily. Like, I didn't
Mm-hmm.
what good would look like. I wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
right? We're not in school.
Mm-hmm.
Here you are, like, you're doing this thing, and immediately there's a good and a bad, a right and a wrong. It worked, it did,
Mm-hmm.
right? We do that all the time. And so part of the practice
Right.
is then being able to say, like, oh, right, I did that thing, right? I'm having the thought that I'm not good at it. I'm having the feeling of failure, something that
Mm-hmm.
helps me practice a little that all those experiences, which are human, are not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
maybe it would help for me to define mindfulness now that you've asked
Yeah.
good questions to kind of clarify it a little more. If that's okay, unless you had another question, I'm happy to pause
Yeah.
too.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. So mindfulness is a word that is used all the time, and I think, often in really beneficial ways, and then sometimes not, so people will talk about like a mindfulness way to make money or things like that, which
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
an application that sort of appeals to me, or I think is with its roots. And it's a word that comes often that comes to us from Buddhist traditions, different Buddhist traditions. I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I'm going to talk more about the secular applications. Jon Kabat-Zinn is who has made that translation quite a bit and is often known by a lot of people. And his most commonly quoted definition is that mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So it's a very short definition that is just packed with things. So it's
Mm-hmm.
attention in a particular way. And again, I would, so that is on purpose with intention. It is paying attention now, which, you may be paying attention now to the fact that you're thinking about the future or worrying about the past. Like, so it's not that you're paying attention now and there is no past and future, but you're noticing that you're here now. Right? Because one of the things that happens, like with worry in particular, is we get so in the future that we can kind of forget we're here now. So like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
if you're worrying about a presentation, sometimes you're worrying about a presentation so much you don't even notice that like that's not what's happening right now. Actually, you're with your family, and maybe that's you, and you might want to know that you're here and doing that, and not moving,
Right.
paying attention in the present moment. He says non-judgmentally. I
Mm-hmm.
with compassion and kindness. I like to sort of focus on the thing you're bringing to it as opposed to the thing you're not doing, because I think it's hard to not do. And certainly my practice of mindfulness, a lot of judgments arise, and then I try to bring
Mm-hmm.
kindness to them. So it's not that I don't have any judgments. It's that when judgments come, I try to notice them and I try to bring compassion. So another way of saying it is it's becoming aware of what's happening in the moment as it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's doing it again and again and again. So it isn't, I think, and sort of related to the clear mind thing we mentioned earlier, often I think people get an image of mindfulness. If you achieve mindfulness, you will be in a steady state of calm openness only in the present moment. And I think, I can't speak to what it's like for people who live in monasteries or practicing as monks. Are engaging in really intensive mindfulness practices all the time. But I can say that I'm using mindfulness in daily life. It's a again and again and again. So our minds come to the moment and they wander off, and they come to the moment and they wander off. And that's the practice. The practice, it's an action. It's coming back. So it's not about staying,
Mm-hmm.
about being able to continually return. And I think that's true around the judgment part of it too. It's not judging, it's bringing kindness, bringing compassion again and again and again. And the more you do it, the more you kind of strengthen that muscle. So it gets a little easier maybe, But you know, during difficult times, or you haven't slept, or you didn't eat, or whatever, it could get really hard again. And so really, when I think about mindfulness, or when I try to talk to people about it, I like to talk about it more as a skill, just like any other skill. And this relates kind of to the thing about, like, am I good at it?
Right.
Skill, you get good through practice, if there's a thing called good.
Right. Right. So,
There isn't.
yes, if I may, I think it's worth reminding our viewers that it's because I do get this the reaction from patients a lot about, well, I can't stay on one thing. My mind is everywhere, and so I can't do it. I can't do this. It's not for me. I tried. It doesn't work for me. As if working means it has to, your mind has to be one place for the entire experience. And I think it's worth reminding folks that it's noticing that your mind has gone somewhere and bringing it back is the work. That is the practice. So guess what? If your mind has wandered 50 times and you brought it back just as often, that's if you've been practicing 50 times in that 5 minutes, so however long you've been practicing. I think that's so important because it's just I think everybody would feel like a total failure if the goal is to stay in one place for 5 minutes.
Exactly. And I think, yeah, and you described that beautifully. And that is exactly how I think of it. I mean, you know, sometimes my experience of my practice is like, all right, my mind is busy. Like I am over the place. And that's helpful too, even if my mind doesn't slow at all in that process. And it's just get that little bit of awareness and a little practice of coming back again and again. That's going to help me in my day. Not that my mind isn't going to wander, because it's going to keep wandering. But as I've done a practice to kind of help build the skill of coming back, I'm going to be more able to come back when I'm in a meeting or in a conversation that's difficult, right? And my mind gets pulled away. I'm going to notice it and I'm going to be able to come back. And that's really the practice. So yeah, it's a process. It's there's a Zen saying that's like, fall down 7 times, get up 8. So it's not a practice of not falling down. It's a practice of getting up. And for me, at least, when you asked at the beginning about my own experience, I think this was an extremely important part of why these practices meant a lot to me, and felt and sort of gave me the possibility of not having to be different from how I am, because I do have a busy mind and my mind does wander, and I do, you know, lock my keys in the car and, you know, whatever, you know, forever leave my phone someplace and spend some portion of my day on my phone. Like, this is part of me. It's how my mind works. It moves quickly from one thing to another. And I think having this way of understanding it has both helped me shape that a little, right? And try to pay a little more attention and be like, okay, I'm putting my phone somewhere. Let me pay attention to it, you know? So I've built some skill around that. But also, really importantly, I've built compassion. And so I'm not as angry with myself when I am mindless or when my mind wanders, because I understand that is just part of how my mind works, and that I can kind of take in my entire mind in the way that it works, with kindness and compassion, even if I wish I were, you know, paying better attention in this moment or whatever. So I do think that it's both, like, it matches experience. It's also that understanding is a piece of, I think mindfulness is really helpful for anxiety, because as we talked about, the cycle of anxiety is the process of judging ourselves and criticizing ourselves and wanting not to be anxious so badly that we get more anxious.
Right.
So this kind of says, like, okay, really anxious right now. It's really hard. It's really painful. Can I notice it happening in my body? What's happening in my mind, right? It gives a little space for just be with this experience that I'm having, in all of its painfulness, but not the piece that says, therefore I am bad, or therefore there's something wrong with me. So yeah, so another way of kind of thinking about the skills are, it helps us to develop this more spacious awareness of the moment. So, through practice, and I'll talk a little about kind of what I mean by practice, which is pretty broad. I can in any given moment, being like, okay, like where are my feet on the ground? How do I feel in the chair? What do I hear? What do I feel? And that gets easier when we practice it. Again, doesn't mean it just comes, but that we kind of develop that as a possibility, as a response option for us. Develop this more curious and compassionate and observing response, like you mentioned. Kind of to employ after the, why is this happening? I want this to go away. It also, over time, I think I've mentioned this in passing, it lets us start to notice that the way we feel right now is often not the way we feel in an hour or 2 hours or 4 hours. One of the things about anxiety, this is true about depression as well, is it kind of comes with this experience like it will always be like this. Like it's stuck here. And if you pay attention, generally that's not true. Even for folks who are generally anxious, there are not the same amount of anxiety and worry all the time. There are ups and downs, and seeing those, it can be really helpful. And then the last skill is what's sometimes called beginner's mind, which is sort of practicing encountering something as though you haven't seen it before or haven't been through it before. So there's like sometimes people do this with like a mindful eating exercise is kind of a classic one that people use, like you give someone a raisin or some other small thing that we eat very quickly and easily without paying attention, and ask people to like look at it as if you've never seen it before, and see what it looks like, look at, all these aspects of it, put it on your tongue, is like a way to kind of practice like all the things that just come along really automatically, which it's good that we respond to things automatically because it helps us kind of do things faster. But at the same time, it allows this possibility that, things that we see as dangerous, we're going to always see as dangerous. Whereas if we can greet things with a beginner's mind, it's easier to have new learning. So mindfulness, that as well.
Now, Dr. Roemer, you wrote in the parentheses there that it's not concentration. Can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between being aware and concentration?
Absolutely. So often, again, people think of mindfulness as like I'm on my breath and only my breath, and that's all there is. And some of that is because of the ways that we practice. So we may sort of practice attention by bringing ourselves back to an anchor like breath. But the goal in mindfulness is this spacious awareness, not one thing and nothing else. So it's different from like meditation that uses a mantra where you use a single word or phrase, or trying to really like narrow in. Like again, mindfulness is expanding, it's not narrowing. So do a little bit more concentration practices to kind of start practicing with your mind, but eventually the goal is really broader than that. And again, that relates to also sort of why it's not like a failure when your mind wanders, because the practice is the whole thing. It's what you're attending, it's what you get pulled by, it's coming back again, it's the whole piece of it.
And I guess in some ways you're in charge of where that spotlight is. Do you make the spotlight wider and take in a range of what's in front of you, what's around you, what's internal, or you can make that spotlight more narrow and focused onto a mantra and so forth. And I suppose, would you say that there's a difference between, we often hear the word mindfulness and meditation used interchangeably, and there's so many different types of meditation practices out there.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I'm gonna go to my practice slide and answer within that. So, and that's I get that question a lot. That kind of, how does mindfulness relate to meditation? And so, I'll say a few things. One is that I think of practice for mindfulness, and a lot of people talk about it this way. There's kind of two kinds. There's formal practice, when you are intentionally engaging in a practice to build this skill. And that's kind of like if you think of developing a skill for sports, right? Like if you're doing like drills in soccer, right? That's like a formal practice for shooting, but like that's not how you shoot in the game. In the game, there's many, many more things going on. So formal practice is when you take time to kind of step aside and do something, and I'll talk about what that something is, to build up this skill. Informal practice is when you apply that skill to your life. And in informal practice, that's really where mindfulness is going to be helpful for anxiety, because largely because the goal isn't that you're able to sit for 30 minutes a day, but then like go on in your life as you always did. The goal is that you're going to pull skills from that practice more generally. One kind of formal practice is certainly meditation, and people use mindfulness differently, and then they use meditation differently. So answering this question of how they're different is sort of hard. But typically, when people talk about meditation, they're talking about some type of repetitive practice that works with the mind, often involving sitting. But again, there's different, like you said, there's different kinds of meditation. So a mantra practice, or a more focused concentration practice, or sometimes people there are meditative practices that are trying to achieve a certain kind of internal state. And that's not really a mindfulness practice, because mindfulness practice is about an expansive awareness and about being with things as they are. But there are meditation practices that are specifically to develop mindfulness skills. And so in that sense, like that would be a mindfulness meditation. And they're open. Does that make sense?
Yes, it sounds like there's so many different types of meditation practices that do overlap with what one might experience while doing mindfulness meditation, mindfulness formal practice.
Exactly. And so, and I'll do that formal practice. So I think partly because of that, I think it's very easy to think that if you talk about bringing mindfulness in, what you mean is you need to sit for 45 minutes a day, every day. And that is certainly one type of formal practice, and that is a practice that has been shown to be helpful. That's not the kind of practice that Sue and I have typically used in our trials, because we've been working with people who are the people who both don't feel like they could sit for 45 minutes, but also don't necessarily have time to sit for 45 minutes, right? You have to have a particular kind of life to be able to engage in a practice for 45 minutes in which no one else needs you for anything. So if you're working jobs, or you have little kids, or you're in a living situation where you don't have your own space to sit in, you can't necessarily do that. And so we're really interested, and I've sort of found in a bunch of contexts, and really broadening what we mean by formal practice. So it could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, it could be sitting, it could be lying down. People do mindful walking, people do standing. I've had people who practice while sitting on the subway. And that's sort of, they know that, or on the commuter rail, they know that they're going to have some period of time where they'll at least be able to sit, and they do that practice there. So there's a whole bunch of ways of doing it. As I mentioned, yoga or Tai Chi or other kinds of movement practices where you are engaging in this. Your mind wanders, you bring it back. Your mind wanders, you bring it back. Anything you do for some period of time and set aside where that's what you're doing, that's what you're engaging in, that's a mindfulness practice.
Tai Chi and yoga and Qigong and all of, what do you think about running? Some people say I am most able to bring back the wandering mind through running.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do think, one of the things that one of my yoga teachers used to say is that people with really busy minds, it's helpful for them to move in order to get a handle on their mind. And I think that was my experience doing yoga. I did, when I first started practicing yoga in particular, I did a lot of Ashtanga yoga, which is a pretty challenging physical practice. And I think for me, it was like I needed my mind to be really needed to do what I was doing, to kind of find it, and think that's not as true for me anymore. As I've practiced more, I think I am more able to also practice sitting. But early on, I think I was able to kind of find that my mind wanders and it comes back because, you know, if you're standing on one foot, you fall over when your mind wanders. And so notice, like like the class moves on and you're not with them anymore. And so there's like this really clear marker as opposed to, you know, I could sit and just be like planning my week for 10 minutes and then realize like, wait, what am I doing right now? You know, so I think sometimes people do find that it's easier for them to get connected with their minds and notice the wandering when they're doing more. So I think whatever I always say this, like it's more about the function than the form. So as long as people are having the experience of noticing their mind and being able to bring it back, starting to see what their minds are like and the ways they wander, starting to be able to observe a little bit and not get totally immersed in their thoughts. Any practice with that, I think is great. And then the next part is really important because just a formal practice isn't going to be enough. Like we also want to then practice bringing these skills that we're developing in these kind of set aside ways into what we're doing in our lives. And there again, I think I mentioned earlier, you know, I always think of like you want to sort of start with the skill that is the easiest to access and then build from there. So, so something like mindfully washing dishes is easier than like mindfully having an argument with a loved one. So you start to something that's a little bit more mindfully brushing your teeth or taking a shower, those kinds of things, you know, mindfully commuting to work, like practicing with your mind while you're in your life and then gradually bringing that to things like a job interview or you know, an argument or a meeting or those places where it can be so much harder to be present, be kind, to have compassion. But it's really, we want to be able to use these skills.
Terrific. So do you know if the dose matters in terms of how often one could start doing the formal practice and then the informal? I mean, it can be whenever and wherever you want to bring into your life. But the formal practice, do we know in research what how much formal practice makes a difference?
That's such a good question. The research is inconsistent. So, and in many, many ways, it's inconsistent. So sometimes some studies have found that consistency of formal practice makes it different, while others have not at all. The problem, I think, is that it is probably less quantity and more quality. And I think quality is hard to measure. And then it also varies because, you know, some treatment programs really, like I said, really emphasize a lengthy practice. So something like mindfulness-based stress reduction, for instance, does have like 45 minutes of practice 6 days a week. As the intervention studies that Sue and I have done allowed people to really vary in their length. So in our study, I found that formal practice wasn't predictive of maintenance of change over time. Did find that informal practice was. So the degree to which people would say, and this was after the fact, so after they'd finished treatment, when they were, you know, hopefully maintaining the gains they had, how much they said that they were applying it in their lives was predictive of how much, how low their anxiety was and their quality of life. So some sense that sort of applying it matters. What I would say from sort of reviewing the literature and from my own observation is, I think that particularly early on, trying to establish a consistent practice matters more than frequency or duration. So what's working in your life is 5 minutes 4 times a week, like do 5 minutes 4 times a week and really do it and be consistent. And then you can see if after you practice some, you might be able to lengthen it a little bit. But what's going to matter more is sort of that you do it. So if I say to you 45 minutes, 6 days a week, and you go home and on day 1, you don't do it. And so then on day 2, you don't do anything because you already have it. that's not helping. So I'm always encouraging people really to find an amount that works for them, and to really kind of figure out how it works in their life. So like what you were saying about, if somebody runs regularly and that's really important to them and they can bring this practice there, I'm going to really encourage that. And, and then see how that goes for them. And maybe we try to add in some other kinds of practices, because I always think flexibility is useful, but start with kind of what you can get going. If that makes sense.
Fold it into taking a look at what works in your life. If you have 5 minutes to spare 4 days a week, then go with that first, and sticking with it. Not really expecting any miraculous changes, but just kind of see what happens after a couple of weeks, and perhaps, or even just after 1 or 2 weeks, and maybe add to that.
Exactly. And partly, and right, I really liked what you added in there about like, don't expect like I just practiced for 5 minutes. Why am I still anxious? Right? Because that's not
right.
going to work. But do you like sort of bring curiosity to this? What is this like? What do I see? What do I notice as this is happening? And what effect is it having on me? And then kind of building from there. And again, also being flexible. One of the things that really appealed to us when we started looking at mindfulness practices is the ways that there are structures out in the community that can support them. So you can find a yoga class like at the Y or wherever, or do Tai Chi or those kinds of things. And so you can also sort of find places where you're also around people, which is nice. Or if don't do that, where you can like write it in on your calendar. Sometimes it's easier, I think, for all of us to do things when like other people, we've signed up for it. Now it's easier to go, going. And are these kind of outside ways also that people can start practice, which I think can be really helpful.
Okay. And I imagine some people would find it easier to start with a group. So in other words, finding groups that they can learn about this more, or practice with others to just do it on their own, perhaps 5 minutes here and there.
Exactly. Yep, I think that's right. And so we sort of talked briefly about like, try it out and see what happens. And so just to kind of quickly go over the kinds of things that I think we notice when we start to practice in any form is that things like that our minds wander and are busy, and also that they change, right? And so this is kind of an opening to, I might have a thought and it might not be true. Which is, a big part of a lot of approaches to anxiety. This is kind of a gentle way in. It's not, is your thought logical or not logical? It's not kind of challenging. It's just like, notice. Minds change. We have different thoughts. This idea that we've been talking about, you can observe experiences without becoming entangled in them. That when we try to push our experience away, it can become more intense. I think that's one of the really powerful things I think that I've noticed in my own practice is it allows me to see this thing that I know is true from research, because there's a lot of research that shows, if I tell you not to think of something, you'll think of it more. But to actually have that experience yourself, that you're there, and your mind wanders and you say like, don't think that. And then that actually kind of gives it a little strength. And when you can feel that, then it helps with kind of changing the way you relate to it. This idea that we can come back again and again and again that we've been talking about. The idea that we can like withstand a lot of experiences. So, some of the most powerful practices for me are the practices that someone might describe as bad. Really anxious or really upset. And I just stay for my 5 minutes because I said I was going to, and I just stay there. And at minute 5, I haven't fallen apart. I'm not, incapacitated. I may not feel better, but I'm not destroyed from sitting with my experience for 5 minutes. And that's actually really important, because a lot of times we don't do that. We spend all of that time trying not to have it. So maybe we are with it for a while, but we were sort of fighting it the whole time. And that's actually part of why it's staying. And I think in the process of relating differently, and maybe our mind's slowing down a little bit from time to time, we can start to see that that different ways of relating to our experience have an effect and that we can make different choices. So for me, a really big part of mindfulness practice is that by being more aware, by being more expansive, by not investing a lot of energy in trying to feel different, I have more energy available to make choices about what I do. One of I think anxiety really does is it starts to really kind of take over our choices. So if you're really anxious and all you're doing is trying not to be anxious, which is really understandable, then that's like every decision you make is about that. This is uncomfortable, I'm going the other way. If you're able to look at that anxiety differently and it doesn't drive you, you have the freedom to make a choice like, oh, this matters to me and I'm going to go towards it even though I'm feeling uncomfortable and anxious.
And this brings back to the idea of avoidance, and you rob yourself of opportunity to realize you have the ability to handle more than you think. I think a lot of thoughts people have when they're feeling anxious is that I can't stand it, I can't, or I don't know how much longer I can deal with this. But in fact, you can. It's not great. You wouldn't want it to be there all the time, but you can surprise yourself.
Exactly. And in fact, paradoxically, and this is even for me, and I've been doing this for a long time, I've been talking about it for a long time. I still find myself surprised that when I stop avoiding, often things get better. So that I experience this in my life all the time is like, I need to be doing some writing. I haven't been writing. I'm distracting myself. I'm not doing it. And part of it is because I'm not sure I know what I want to say or whatever. It is always the case that if I sit down for an hour and write, I feel better. It doesn't matter what I write. It doesn't matter if it comes easy. It's just better for me when I do it. And yet still I might be like, no, do this over here. No, and so, right, when we get to make those choices, we get to also have the experience that not only can we handle it, but actually doing things that are important to us actually changes our experience because we get a sense of satisfaction, a sense of meaning.
So powerful, right? But it doesn't limit your life. It doesn't have to limit what you do.
Exactly. Let me just skip back this because I think I said a lot of this already. So, just to talk a teensy bit more, if it's all right, about this kind of doing what matters, which is the kind of third part that I think mindfulness really helps with. But I don't know that it always helps with it automatically. I think we have to think about it too. That when we're willing to have our experience, it gives us the freedom to do things that are important to us and that we can move toward what's important instead of away from what we fear. This is kind of what I just said. And also that, again, by not being busy fighting with our experience, letting our experience rise and fall with these practices gives us some space to actually clarify what's important to us and to make intentional choices. So we're able to notice in a moment. So for instance, if, we're in a group situation and maybe there's something we really want to share, we think is important. And also anxiety arises. What if it doesn't make sense? What if I'm not clear? If we can notice that, okay, I just got tense and I'm thinking about not saying what I want to say, and then I can pause, then I might be able to choose, you know what, I want to say this. And my voice might be a little shaky or my palms might sweat, but I want to share this. And so we kind of have the anxiety take the response with us as a companion instead of just automatically not doing it, right? Which is so often the case with anxiety that it almost feels like we didn't even make a decision. We just were going this way. Nope, I'm going to go this way. Is anxiety, and this is a chance to be have that moment where we're going to turn and be able to say, do I want to turn or do I want to take a risk here because it's associated with something that matters to me? Because so much of what matters to us is also anxiety provoking. Being vulnerable, trying new things, making new friends.
And I hear that the pause piece, this idea, I like the word pause because it doesn't take, and it's literally just slowing down of noticing the pattern of your wanting to get away, wanting to escape from the experience, and just kind of like, whoa, for a second. And then you can decide to continue avoiding or not. But then you have at least that moment where you could decide
Exactly.
what I want to do.
Choice instead of a reaction. Exactly. Right. So you might in that moment say, you know what, like, not today. And I'm going to do it some other time, whatever. Like, I'm tired. I'm feeling kind of off today. Of course, if we're doing that all the time, we want to look at that. But absolutely, it doesn't mean we always have to turn toward everything or do everything that's frightening. It's that mindfulness can help us feel like we have some agency in that, like we can make a choice if we choose. So I thought, happy to answer other questions, but I thought it maybe just talk about some first steps for people to take.
Fantastic.
And again, I think I said some of this already, but developing some kind of sustainable, consistent formal practice of any duration. So thinking about that. And, we talked a little bit about group ways. It's also the case that there are endless recordings of mindfulness practices available online for free. On the next slide, I'll show again our webpage, which has a lot of downloadable exercises that people can listen to. So it's also possible to do these practices at home alone. And sometimes that's helpful for people, particularly if being with other people is one source of anxiety. So sometimes starting alone can be a nice, initial practice. Like I said, beginning some type of informal practice. So I really like washing my dishes mindfully. It's really changed my relationship to dishwashing, because now it's like I pay attention to the water and
the soap. But
yeah, exactly. And go from dirty dishes to clean dishes or whatever, and just have that kind of moment of a practice in the midst of a task I really need to get done anyway. We encourage people to also take some time to reflect on or write about what matters to them, so that when you have that moment of a pause, it's easier to make a decision. Like, is this something that's important to me? Is it meaningful? Because again, if it's not meaningful, there's certainly no need to try. But if it is meaningful, you want to know so that you aren't just habitually avoiding things that matter. Bringing kindness to our reactions to ourselves. So starting to notice a little bit. We have an inner voice that says, why are you like this? Other people aren't like this. Get over it, whatever. It's kind of a hard way to go through life. And sometimes it's nice to think about how you might respond if you were a friend instead of yourself. Which harsh, or might you be a little more gentle and kinder? And then just this kind of practicing turning toward instead of turning away, just noticing kind of gently what it's like to sort of feel that urge to avoid and maybe just pause there, like we said. So just these little shifts, like I said, changes this habit, so that it's sort of, now the habit's going in the other direction, right? Now we're developing a habit of turning towards being kind, of making choices, and we can kind of shift things a little bit. And so again, Sue and I have written about some of these things. Mindful Way Through Anxiety is a self-help book, and Worry Less, Live More, like a companion workbook. If people like the idea of kind of writing stuff down and going through worksheets, that's a great book for that. This website at the bottom, Mindful Way Through Anxiety. Oh, it should say mindfulwaythroughanxiety.com. Sorry, it shouldn't have book in it. We changed that. Is a website that includes mindfulness exercises. So most of the exercises that we use in the books are there. You can listen to the recordings. We're on Twitter and Facebook if people are into things like that.
That is so wonderful. I'm so glad you mentioned those exercises. It can be overwhelming to, I think, know where to start. So our viewers can go ahead and take a look at the site and see what works for them, and try a variety of exercises and find one that meets their needs as they begin to fold this into their lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hope that they're helpful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roemer. This has been a really, really helpful presentation. I mean, there's so much to talk about, and I'm glad I think we were able to cover a lot of ground. And I hope our viewers find the webinar to be very helpful. And if you do, I certainly want to encourage you to click like on the video and share it with your friends. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Roemer, for being part of the webinar. And we are so happy to have you. And to everyone, till next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.